Casey Anthony's trial over the death of her 2-year-old daughter, Caylee Marie Anthony, quickly became one of the most polarizing criminal proceedings in modern American history. In June 2008, the 22-year-old single mother left the Orlando home she shared with her parents, taking Caylee with her after a heated argument on Father's Day, a departure that would later be portrayed by the prosecution as the first step in a premeditated murder plot. When Caylee's grandmother, Cindy Anthony, finally reported her missing on July 15, 2008, she placed a 911 call describing a dead body smell emanating from Casey's car, a detail that set the tone for the ensuing investigation. Police impounded the vehicle and, aided by a cadaver dog that signaled the presence of human decomposition in the trunk and even the backyard, uncovered forensic evidence suggesting a body had been hidden there. The case seemed to close on December 11, 2008, when a utility worker discovered a bag containing a child's skeletal remains in a wooded area less than a mile from the Anthony residence. The medical examiner ruled the death a homicide of undetermined means. The state's response was swift and aggressive. A grand jury indicated Casey on October 14, 2008 for first-degree murder, aggravated child abuse, aggravated manslaughter of a child, and 4 counts of providing false information to law enforcement officers. Prosecutors even announced an intent to seek the death penalty in April 2009, arguing that the alleged motive, escaping parental responsibility, was sufficiently heinous to warrant capital punishment. After a series of bond hearings, a $500,000 bail was set, later rescinded, and Casey was held without bond until September 2008, when a group of supporters posted the amount and secured her release. The pretrial phase featured a litany of contentious issues: a hair strand found in the car trunk that matched Caylee's brush, air sampling results indicating high levels of chloroform and other decomposition chemicals, and a controversial internet search history that appeared to show searches for chloroform and head injuries on the family computer. But before the trial and the media sensation, there was a family, and there was a little girl. Casey Anthony was born on March 19, 1986 in Warren, Ohio, to George Anthony, a former homicide detective, and his wife Cindy Anthony, a homemaker. The couple later moved to Orlando, Florida, where they would raise their children together. Casey was the youngest child. She had an older brother, Lee Anthony, who was mentioned only in passing in family interviews, and she grew up in what friends and neighbors described as a cliché, smart, kind, all-American household. The Anthony home was a multi-generational one. Casey's parents lived in the same house and acted as the primary caregivers for their grandchildren, a situation that would later become central to the investigation after their granddaughter's disappearance. Caylee Marie Anthony entered the world on August 9, 2005. Casey repeatedly denied to family members that she was pregnant, before finally accepting it at 7 months, and then offering vague explanations and even suggesting that the child might belong to a former fiancé, Jesse Grund, or potentially, quote, a young man who supposedly died in a car accident. The identity of Caylee's biological father was never publicly disclosed, and no paternity suit ever materialized, leaving the question of her parentage unsolved throughout the case. Despite Casey's denials, her parents, George and Cindy, were aware of the baby's existence and cared for Caylee in their home, providing a stable environment for the toddler, while Casey, who was still in her early 20s, struggled with unemployment and a social life that often revolved around nightly partying. Caylee's early life was largely spent under the supervision of her grandparents, with Casey frequently absent due to work or social obligations. According to the official timeline, Casey told her mother that she was taking Caylee to a nanny named Zanny Fernandez Gonzalez, and later claimed that the family was headed to Tampa on a work trip. Both statements later proven false and used as the basis for the false information charges that ultimately led to Casey's conviction on misdemeanor counts. This pattern of deception, combined with the grandparents' hands-on caregiving role, contributed to an environment where the line between parental authority and extended family responsibility became increasingly blurred. The Anthony family's public image shifted dramatically after Caylee's disappearance. Prior to 2008, the family was largely invisible to the national media, living an unremarkable suburban life. Following the 911 call and the subsequent discovery of Caylee's remains, George and Cindy became unwilling focal points of a media frenzy that portrayed them alternately as grieving grandparents and, at times, complicit parties in a presumed cover-up. Their testimonies during the trial, George's claim that he smelled a human decomposition odor when he retrieved the car, and Cindy's desperate search for chloroform online, were dissected on live television, further exposing the family's internal discord to a nationwide audience. In sum, the Anthony family's background is a mosaic of seemingly ordinary suburban stability, fractured by concealed truths and strained relationships, Casey's denial of her pregnancy, the undisclosed paternity of Caylee, and the grandparents' dual role of caretakers and later as key witnesses created a volatile dynamic that set the stage for one of the most contentious criminal cases in recent memory. Understanding these early familial interactions is essential for grasping how personal histories, hidden motives, and intergenerational tensions converged to shape the narrative that captivated and divided the American public. On Father's Day, June 15, 2008, an argument erupted between Casey and her parents. The following morning, June 16, 2008, Casey left the house with Caylee, telling her mother that she was taking the toddler to a nanny named Zenaida. In reality, Casey's plan was to travel for work, a claim that later proved false. Over the next 31 days, Casey was not seen caring for Caylee. Instead, she was spotted at nightclubs and posting photos on social media. During this month, Casey gave a series of contradictory explanations to her mother. On the 17th of June, she said the nanny was looking after Caylee, and then she added that the family was traveling to Tampa on a work trip. Calls from George and Cindy to Casey grew increasingly urgent, but Casey repeatedly deflected, saying the child was safe with the nanny or at a theme park. The police response began the moment Cindy Anthony dialed 911 on July 15, 2008. The dispatcher recorded Cindy's statement that she had not seen her granddaughter for 31 days and that the family car emitted a foul odor, quote, like a dead body. Orlando police logged the call as a missing child report and immediately dispatched officers to the Anthony residence. When officers arrived, they found Casey Anthony visibly indifferent while her parents were frantic. Police noted the stark contrast between Casey's calm demeanor and her parents' panic. They tried not to judge too harshly. After all, you never know how you will react to a child going missing. But waiting a whole month to report her being kidnapped, that was a red flag. Investigators then pursued Casey's narrative about the nanny. Casey claimed that Zanny was recommended to her through a co-worker named Jeffrey at Universal, and that her co-worker had a young son, Zach, who was being cared for by Zanny as well. Jeffrey and Casey sharing the nanny saved them both some money, and Casey could be sure that Caylee was receiving quality care while she was at work. However, Zach and Jeffrey had moved out of state a few months prior, so now Zanny was only watching Caylee. By now, police were asking her for the phone number so they could attempt to reach Zanny the nanny, and Casey refused to provide him with the number, eventually claiming that she could not remember the full number off the top of her head. Frustrated, the police asked her for Jeff's number, only coincidentally, he had recently gotten a new number and she didn't know it. Casey proceeded to claim that on June 14th, she arrived to pick her daughter up from Zanny and that no one was home. She said she was not worried and just searched for them, all on her own. After not finding Caylee, she gave up and went home to her boyfriend, Tony Lazaro. Something that detectives noticed is that Casey seemed to be answering all of their questions with confidence, and without any emotion. The interview was dragging on, and detectives were no closer to finding Caylee. Because of this, it was decided that they would have Casey show them where Zanny the nanny's apartment was, so they could search it themselves. Getting the location of the apartment was like trying to pull teeth. Casey had dropped Caylee off at this apartment 5 days a week, and yet struggled to recall its location. Finally, they were able to locate Zanny's apartment. Peering through the windows, it was apparent no one was living there. The apartment was empty and even dusty, indicating it had been empty for a while. A maintenance man was questioned and revealed that the apartment had been vacant for months. When the manager of the apartments was questioned, he revealed no one by the name of Zenaida had ever lived there. It is at this point that something shocking happened. George, Casey's father and an ex-police officer, pulled detectives aside and told them he was worried that Casey was hiding something. George begged them to keep questioning Casey. He loved his daughter, but he was more worried about his missing granddaughter than he was about Casey going to jail. After this conversation, detectives decided to talk to Casey's boss. After all, she was an event planner at Universal Studios. Her boss would know her well. They had even had business trips together. First, they used the phone number that Casey had given them, and to no one's shock, it was a fake number. Detectives at this point were getting annoyed at Casey's antics and decided to take her to Universal so she could show them her office and speak to her boss. Casey led them to the employee entrance where they were unable to find her name on the acceptable admissions list. Somehow, Casey managed to talk her way in. I suspect her being there with the police had something to do with it. Casey led them around the theme park for around 30 minutes, seeming confused and like she was unsure where she was. Eventually, Casey led them into a building, even saying hi to one of the workers there, before getting lost in the hallway. Once she reached a dead end, Casey turned to the detectives laughing and said that she didn't work there. She hadn't worked there in 2 years, actually. She had been fired, and she wasn't even an event planner. She worked at a photo kiosk. It was at this point that the police were enraged. They were trying to find Caylee, and Casey was leading them on a wild goose chase. Casey was placed under arrest for obstruction of an investigation and making false statements. It was requested that Casey not be allowed bond until Caylee was found. While Casey sat in her cell awaiting her bond, hearing her parents were in front of the media asking for help, their stories were run nationally. Casey, for her part, was furious that her parents were speaking to the press and drawing so much attention to her. The day after her arrest, Casey sat in an interrogation room with detectives. She was confronted immediately, and they told her they knew that she was lying about pretty much everything. They told her that Zanny did not live in the apartment she led them to, and in fact had never lived in that apartment complex at all. They also said they didn't believe Zanny was a real person. They could not find anyone with that name in the state of Florida. Not only that, but Casey had invented her boss, and Zach, Jeff's son. Police discovered this when they went to interview Jeff about Zanny's whereabouts. He was confused and claimed he did not know a Zanny. He also had no children and therefore did not need a nanny. In addition, he didn't even work at Universal during the same time that Casey had, having been fired years before. At this point, detectives were practically pleading with Casey to tell them where Caylee was. They just wanted to find Caylee and make sure she was safe. But Casey refused to admit anything. She instead said that Zanny had likely taken Caylee out of the country. She was claiming a woman that she had invented took her daughter out of the country. The day after her interview, July 17, 2008, Casey was seen by a judge who said, quote, "The truth and Casey are strangers," end quote, for which he denied her bail. It was at this point that Casey retained the services of lawyer Jose Baez, who advised Casey to not talk to the police anymore. Considering she was just digging herself a deeper hole each time she opened her mouth, I'd say that was a good move. At this point, detectives began looking into the evidence from Casey's car. You know, the one her mother claimed smelled like a dead body on her 911 call. There were samples that had been taken from the car and sent for analysis, and the results are upsetting. They showed signs of decomposition, and there was a dark circular stain. Not only that, of the samples taken, 7 of the ones showed decomposition were able to be connected to Caylee. Then there was the chloroform. There was so much of it in the trunk samples that the scientist said he had never seen this much in his 20 years of work. Eerie, right? They also found a hair that they believed belonged to Caylee. Normally, finding a child's hair in their mom's car isn't a big deal. However, this hair had root banding, which is a ring that appears only after death. Forensics were unable to prove it was from Caylee, but it for sure came from a female member of the Anthony family, and since Casey and her mom were still very much alive, it was assumed to be Caylee's. After finding all of this evidence, the police began to question the friends and family of Casey Anthony in an attempt to create a timeline. Casey claimed to have been desperately searching for her daughter for those 30 days. However, what the police found instead was rage-inducing. Casey had spent the whole month partying, going to clubs, even getting a tattoo. She had moved in with Tony after a fight with her parents and told him that Caylee was with her nanny. She then proceeded to have what was seen as a month-long party. She even participated in a hot body contest at a club. These are not the actions of a grieving mother. While the investigators were still trying to collect evidence for a trial, Baez, her lawyer, managed to get a judge to grant her bail. It was set at $500,000, and Casey's parents surprisingly denied paying her bail, hoping sitting in prison would potentially make her talk. However, for some reason, someone else paid her bail. This man was a bounty hunter from California, Leonard Padilla. He was apparently hoping that Casey would be more likely to surrender Caylee's location if she was free. Thankfully, however, Casey was rearrested after a few days as a former friend pressed charges for fraud, as Casey had forged checks in her name. At this point, the public was no longer on Casey's side. Why? Because her initial interview videos had been released, and everyone saw how uninterested Casey was. She acted like finding her daughter wasn't really her concern. This time, her parents actually did post her bail, wanting to keep her safe and worrying she would be in danger in prison. Once Casey went home, police would have to regularly be called to clear protesters from the Anthony yard. It is at this time that Casey was given the name the worst mother in America. The Anthony family also hired a private investigator, hoping that he would be able to find Caylee since the police couldn't. However, it was a member of the public that would find her on December 11th, 2008. A meter reader for the electric company was in the woods near the Anthony home when he found a trash bag that was partially opened, and he saw something sitting in it. Curious, he used a stick to lift the object, and it was a child's skull. He dropped the skull and called the police. The bag and area around had Caylee's bones scattered, likely due to animal activity. The body was bundled up with a Winnie the Pooh bedsheet. After discovering the body, they get a warrant to search the Anthony house, where they find bedding that matches the sheet. And they also find a search for chloroform on the family computer. It was at this point that detectives had to start finding a why to present to the jury. Why did they think Casey would kill Caylee, and how could they convey that to a jury? Looking back, Casey had always told outlandish lies. She had dropped out of high school without telling her parents, and when they did find out, they threw her a graduation party so that other people would not find out. Casey was pregnant at this party, but constantly denied it to her parents, not coming clean until she was 7 months pregnant and could no longer hide it. Casey told her parents that she was wanting to surrender the baby, but they convinced her to keep Caylee and provided housing and financial support. Cindy and George also provided much of Caylee's care and were said to be loving grandparents who enjoyed spoiling their granddaughter. Casey was upset at becoming a mom so young, having only been 19 when Caylee was born. She enjoyed going out and often left Caylee with her parents in order to do so. This was the basis of the prosecution's claims. From here, all of this information is alleged and not true, as Casey has been found innocent. This is merely the speculation of the police and prosecution. On June 9th, Cindy and Casey got into an argument. Cindy felt that Casey wasn't doing anything with her life and wanted her to get a job or enroll in college. Casey instead chose to move out. Casey moved her and Caylee into the house of her ex-boyfriend and stayed there for a week, while claiming she was on a work trip with Caylee when they were actually on a shopping spree with a stolen credit card. After a week of Cindy and George begging to see Caylee, Casey brought her daughter for a quick visit on June 16th. This is the last day anyone ever saw Caylee alive. I want to remind you that this is all police speculation. It is at this point that Casey realized her life was not going how she wanted. She was a single mom with no direction. She wanted to party and go to clubs, not change diapers and worry about nap time. Caylee was a burden to Casey that she was tired of caring for. That night, while George and Cindy were out of the house, Casey searched for chloroform on the family computer, then made it with chemicals commonly found under the kitchen sink, and got her dad's duct tape from the garage. That night, Casey tucked Caylee into bed before holding the chloroform over her face until she was unconscious. Casey then covered Caylee's face with duct tape, and Caylee then suffocated to death. Caylee died with Casey watching to ensure her plan would not fail. Afterwards, she put her daughter's body in the trunk of her car with her Winnie the Pooh sheet and some trash bags. Casey then moved in with her boyfriend Tony, all while letting her daughter's body start to decompose in the trunk of her car. A week later, Casey disposed of Caylee's body in the woods near her parents' home. She knew that these woods were rarely used, and Caylee would not be found for months or even years. Because she had left Caylee in her car all week, she had to try and get rid of the smell. However, she was unable to and instead chose to abandon her car on June 27th. Her car remained where she dumped it until it was impounded, and Casey spent the next few weeks living life without any responsibility. During this time, Cindy and George were begging Casey to let them see Caylee. Casey told them she was busy with work and they would see her soon. July 15th, George received a call from the impound lot since the car was under his name. When he got to the impound lot to retrieve Casey's car is when he noticed the smell. As a former cop, he knew what death smelled like. Cindy managed to track Casey down, and when asked where Caylee was, Casey refused to tell her. Cindy called the police to have Casey arrested for stealing her credit card. Casey begged her mom to drop the charges, with Cindy agreeing only after Casey told her where Caylee was. This is when Casey created the kidnapping story on the spot. Casey Anthony's trial began May 24th, 2011. She was charged with 1 count of first-degree murder, 1 count of child abuse, and 1 count of manslaughter, as well as 4 counts of providing false information. During the opening statements, the prosecution explained the timeline that the police had constructed and motives Casey may have had to kill her daughter. The defense, well, they chose to pin the blame for Caylee's death on George Anthony. Baez claimed that Caylee had fallen asleep with Casey, and when Casey woke up, Caylee was gone. Her and George then searched the house, before George found Caylee's body floating in the pool out back. Caylee was blue and beyond life-saving measures. At this point, Baez says George told Casey to leave the house. He told Casey he would handle everything, and since he was a former police officer, Casey believed he knew the best way to handle the situation. Now here's the shocking part. Baez claimed the reason Casey was so willing to listen to her dad and do what he said was because she had been sexually abused by him growing up. Casey had simply been trained her whole life to do what he said, and now was no different. I want to mention that no claims of abuse have ever been proven, and this is the only time they have ever been mentioned. The defense brought in an expert to claim the decomposition found in Casey's car was from groceries that had been forgotten, specifically ground beef. In addition, the defense argued that the hair with the banding on it could not be definitively proven to be Caylee's, just that it was from a member of the Anthony family, and the chloroform found in the trunk could have been from leftover pool water. Now, the biggest evidence in the prosecution's case was the duct tape found on and near Caylee. You don't duct tape the face of someone who was already dead. Since all the soft tissues had already decomposed, there was no way to prove that Caylee had in fact been suffocated. There were 4 strips of duct tape found, 1 hanging onto her skull and 2 found in the bag with her. 1 was outside of the bag. The prosecution argued that the position of Caylee's jaw indicated it was held in place by the tape as she decomposed. However, the defense pointed out that would only be true if her skull was undisturbed, but there had been animal activity, and her skull was even picked up and dropped by the man who found it, thus making the position evidence insignificant. In addition, the defense also brought in an expert to testify that there were no skin cells on the duct tape, which should have been present had it been used to cover Caylee's face. The defense used their story about George hiding her body. However, George testified that this was false. Therefore, the defense was able to make George seem unreliable due to it being discovered he had a mistress. Whenever Casey was out partying, she would tell her friends that Caylee was being watched by Zanny the nanny. Now, for those of you that don't know, Zanny is a common street name for Xanax, which you can take and it makes you tired. George thinks that Casey would drug Caylee so she could sneak out and party without worrying about Caylee getting up. However, your body builds up a tolerance to Xanax relatively quickly, meaning Casey would need to keep giving higher and higher doses to Caylee. That night in July, Casey overdosed Caylee and panicked, knowing if she called 911, Xanax would be found in Caylee's system. She left Caylee in her trunk for a week and tried to come up with the story. Then, when confronted by her mom, just spit out the first thing that she could think of. There is no evidence to back up this theory. However, I personally feel it is believable. After all, Zanny the nanny had been something Casey joked about long before Caylee died. I want to clarify that this has never been proven in court. This is my opinion. What do you think happened to Caylee Anthony? Do you believe the defense's story about her falling into the family pool? Do you think Casey planned her death in advance? Or was it an accidental overdose? Sadly, Caylee is unlikely to ever get justice. This podcast is written and hosted by me, Shay, and edited by my husband, Toby. Give us a like and follow and leave a review. It really helps weirdos like me to keep researching even weirder cases like this. This has been The Evidence Locker. I'll see you next time. Stay curious, stay safe. Join us next week as we open another locker.